Good evening and welcome to the second in our series of Wes Talks, organised by the New Room and in partnership with the Methodist Church Learning Network Southwest. We're delighted to see you this evening, and we look forward to sharing more about Hannah More with you. The New Room is the oldest Methodist building in the world, and we opened a new visitor centre in 2017 with a new cafe, museum, library and archives, and we do look forward to welcoming you when we're back open. My name is Kate Rogers and I'm the Collections Manager and Community Engagement Officer for the New Room. And behind the scenes is my colleague Mandy Briggs, who will be looking after the tech side of things for us. I just have a few tech notices for us before we begin. Please note that this talk is being recorded. And during the talk, you will be able to see the panelists and the speakers, but not be able to see each other. Your own video and audio will be switched off. If there are particular questions you would like to ask our panel, please save them for later. We will be inviting you for a question time at the end of the session. And we'll be inviting you to write these into the Q&A facility at the bottom of your screen. You can access this by clicking Q&A next to the chat function. The aim of Wes Talks is to explore life and faith in today's world, and it's often linked to historic characters who try to make a difference. Tonight's talk, we're going to be looking at Hannah More, and the question we've asked is, moral reformer or political manipulator? First of all, I'd like to introduce and welcome our panel members. We have Dr. Jo Edwards, who is our main speaker for this evening. Welcome, Jo. I'm just going to introduce you with a short bio. So Jo is a historian of Hannah More's Mendip schools and heritage education professional. She's a trustee of Hannah More Trust, a charity founded to advance the education and the public life of historic significance of the life and works of Hannah More. She is also the chair of trustees at Nosey Tithe Barn Trust. This is a site of Hannah More's schools from 1792 to 1833. And since 2012, Jo has led their education team as part of a Heritage Lottery funded project. She teaches about Hannah More to people of all ages, from primary school children to adults in further education. Next, I'd like to introduce Jane Duffus. Jane is an author, journalist, editor, and public speaker. She is currently working on her 5th book, elegantly understated, 175 Years of the Fears Watch Company, which will be published in spring of this year. Her 4th book, The Women Who Built Bristol, Volume 2, was published in October 2019. After almost a decade of working on lifestyle newsstand magazines in London, and a further decade freelancing from her current home in Bristol, Jane's key areas of interest are independent pop culture, women's history, feminism, and endurance running. All of these bios should be appearing in the chat function if you'd like to take a closer look. And next we have Dr. Wendy Allen. Welcome, Wendy. Wendy is a Learning and Development Officer for Southwest Region of the Methodist Church. Wendy recently joined the team from being a religious education specialist in secondary education. Her main areas of work are worship, leading and preaching, candidate support, and supporting lifelong learning in all ages and stages of faith. Her journey with Methodism so far has given her a deep love of Wesley's hymns, a spiritual life centered on sacramental, and commitment to always seeking deeper theological understanding. Thank you all for being here this evening and for taking part in our discussion. First of all, I'm going to invite Jo to speak more about Hannah More's life, her views and values, and how she made centre stage amidst widespread opposition. After Jo has spoken, I will hand back to some of the speakers for a panel discussion. So over to you, Jo. Thank you very much.
Okay, so thanks so much for everyone who's come along tonight and for joining us when we're going to be discussing Hannah More, one of the most influential women in Bristol and Somerset in the 18th century. The title of our discussion tonight on first glance seems to be pure hyperbole, but Hannah More becomes both and more besides, despite her views extolling the traditional domestic sphere for women. The key driver in her activities is her faith and her conviction in the aims of the evangelical wing of the Anglican Church. There are many established views of Hannah More. She's been cast by some historians as a wolf in sheep's clothing, attempting to suppress radicalism, dismissed by others as humorless and complacent, someone who could be unctuously sycophantic where influential men were involved. And others point to her as someone who wanted the poor to stay in their place and to be happy with that, protecting the class inequalities of the period. But by looking at Hannah More's activism and writing, we can see how her actions are a consequence of faith. Our title serves mostly to introduce some of the key contradictions and complexities that come to the surface when you look at Hannah More's work and Hannah More's activism, and to help evaluate the idea of a fundamentally conservative outlook demonstrated by a woman who then doesn't stick to the fundamentally conservative realm of the domestic sphere. Her ideas with respect to class, piety and duty have led to her being rather accurately described as the first Victorian, which seems highly contradictory compared with the activism of the same woman of independent means, involved with political campaigning, propaganda, interventions in the work of the clergy and their appointments, and social mobility. Certainly at some points, Hannah More's activism makes it seem like she doesn't follow her own rules. More had a very long life. She died in 1833 at the age of 88. So there's quite a lot of Hannah More to go through. So what I've chosen to focus on is the two examples of her activism and reaction to them. So the first of these is her activism against the slave trade as part of the Clapham sect. And second, the Blagden controversy, which arose from her work setting up schools in Somerset. So to introduce Hannah More very briefly, she was born in the parish of Stapleton in Fishponds in 1745, and some of you who are local to Bristol will know the schoolhouse in which she was born. She was the daughter of a schoolmaster and one of 5 sisters, all of whom were well educated, and the sisters were successful in setting up a school for young women close to Bristol Cathedral, and then they built their own premises on Park Street as the school became more popular. Their success meant that they became networked with the social elites in the city of Bristol, but also with individuals in wider society, such as Dr. Samuel Johnson. Hannah More wrote plays for the schoolgirls to perform, and after her engagement did not lead to marriage, but to a negotiated annuity. She moved to London, helped by David Garrick to success at Covent Garden, and she joined in the congenial society of London, including the Bluestocking literary circles. However, her course was profoundly changed by meeting members of the Clapham sect, a group of evangelical members of the Anglican Communion who met at the Holy Trinity Church in Clapham. The relationships forged with William Wilberforce, Henry Thornton and the Macaulay family, and a number of other influential men brought her into the abolition movement. Her friendship with Reverend John Newton changed her opinion entirely of how she should use her writing talent. Hannah More had some public prestige by this point, and the Clapham group, as part of the abolition committee, urged her to support their campaign. Hannah More's first role in the public sphere, therefore, was when her poem, Slavery, a Poem, was published on the 8th of February in 1788, at the same time as Newton's Thoughts upon the African Slave Trade. This was followed in March by John Wesley's fierce sermon at the New Rooms, which was mentioned by Gary Best in the previous Wes Talk. The purpose of all of this activity was to try to influence the public and MPs ahead of the Commons debate on the Dolben Bill, which was vociferously opposed by Matthew Brickdale, the Bristol MP and owner of Enslaved People. Hannah More wrote this poem rather quickly, and she wrote later, "I grieve I did not set about it sooner, as it must now be done in such a hurry. But good or bad, if it does not come out at the particular moment when the discussion comes on in Parliament, it will not be worth a straw." If you haven't read the poem, the Poetry Archive online has a recording of it, read by the poet Patience Agbabi, which transformed the way that I felt about the poem. And I urge you to listen to it. In the poem, More strives to effect empathy and compassion with enslaved people on a basis absolutely rooted in scripture. The anti-slave trade activism of the evangelical group relied on the conviction that all people were made in God's image and were precious in his sight. God was the father of all mankind, all nations were his offspring of one blood. The poet William Cowper, writing in 1782, gives a brilliantly concise encapsulation of the theology behind this. That souls have no discriminating hue, alike important in their maker's view, that none are free from blemish since the fall, and love divine has paid one price for all. The doctrines of creation, fall, and redemption underscore the human equality in the eyes of God for these evangelical abolitionists. In More's poem, these themes are directly contrasted with the Enlightenment theories of racial inferiority, such as those from David Hume or Voltaire, which saw Black people as naturally inferior. In her poem, More writes that perish the illiberal thought that would debase the native genius of the sable race. Perish the proud philosophy which sought to rob them of powers of equal thought. Does then the immortal principle within change with the casual colour of a skin? As an aside here, I think it's also important to note that More is at times very patronising about Africa and Africans in her letters and writings. In her tract Village Politics, Africa is used as an ultimate example of ignorance. So for our 21st century sensibilities, some of her more condescending ideas are quite problematic and linked to difficult conceptions of empire and missionary conversion. Her poem Slavery is an effective distillation of the evangelical line on the need to end slave trade. And what Hannah More innovates here begins a process of abolition being linked to moral superiority, and perhaps later the roots of a British superiority in the narrative of abolition. In the poem she writes, "Shall Britain, where the soul of freedom reigns, forge chains for others she herself disdains?" David Olusoga, in his book Black and British, which many of you will be familiar with, talks about the construction of the narrative of abolition, both of the elevation of Wilberforce as the key proponent and the invisibility of Black campaigners and women involved in abolition. Those narratives were also constructed and continue to be dominated by an idea of British superiority compared to other countries in terms of abolition. And this is still apparent now in our bubbling culture war in the press and in online forums. So what was the response? Well, the response to this, of course, is vitriolic press attacks of the people in the campaign, which doesn't stop them in any way. And Hannah More continues to publish and organise sugar boycotts. Of course, Hannah More is publishing her writing from a place which is in the hinterland of enslavement, with huge amounts of people linked to the trade. It is important to reflect on the local scale of connection. Many Bristolians and the wider Southwest profited from the slave trade, not only shipbuilders and slavers, but also merchants, tradespeople and manufacturers, sugar refining, bottle production and brassware. So many people were connected that this was one of the main concerns that Thomas Clarkson had when he came to Bristol. And he wrote that, "I began rather to tremble at the arduous task of attempting to subvert a branch of the trade in this large city." And it is interesting to reflect on Hannah More and her sisters on Park Street, around the corner from Pinney's house in Great George Street, which some of you will have visited as the Georgian Museum in Bristol. And they're daring to speak against the trade and the livelihoods of so many in the city. More was insulated from the worst of the anti-abolition reaction by having high-profile friends to protect her, and the sheltered social spaces of abolitionists in Clapham and in Bristol. And in Bristol, this is very much through the Harford family. It cannot be mentioned, or can't not be mentioned, that Clapham Common, the scene of this weekend's events of protest, was at that time a closely woven social network, a ring of houses of abolitionists together with their church. The Common also had houses of people like Vassall and Hibbert and other owners of enslaved peoples and active traders, but it was primarily a tight-knit abolitionist campus, which afforded protection, which meant that Hannah More was socially insulated from attacks. The main criticisms of More and all the Claphamites was that abolition was essentially a revolutionary activity. Many of them had initially welcomed the French Revolution, as they believed the new government would abolish the country's slave trade. More zealously saw the pro-slavery faction as unchristian. And she later wrote that, "I knew that every anti-abolitionist in the world was of necessity an enemy to religious instruction." In the context of the terror, it became very important for the evangelicals to emphasise their patriotism, to deflect from this criticism, and the focus became the state of the nation, absolutely allied to needing to clear its moral debts, and that religious reform was the key to national revival. So once they distanced themselves from ideas of revolution, the next element of criticism was that the abolitionists were more worried about those in slavery abroad rather than those at home. Excuse me. The criticism was very similar to those now who protest about the foreign aid budgets, that charity begins at home. And there was an alliance between the pro-slavery factions in Parliament, with activists such as William Cobbett wanting reform for the poor in Britain, criticising the abolitionists for their seeming disregard of the poor. So Wilberforce and Moore's next element of campaign was based in Somerset, and it's seen by some historians as a shield for this criticism, that they were unconcerned for the poor and that this was part and parcel of the abolition campaign. But this time, although the Clapham sect helped to finance the project, Hannah More is the spearhead of the campaign, which is essentially driven by religious and moral reform to improve the nation. Hannah and Patty More, her sister, set up schools across Somerset in the backdrop of what has been termed the Church of England's age of negligence. And certainly, as E.P. Thompson put it, had the Church of England not been ineffective, Methodism would have been neither necessary nor possible. Hannah More's reforming zeal is front and centre of her campaign. She was outspoken in her private correspondence about the state of the church in rural areas, for example, about drunken and absent priests. Her public prestige and the success of her project, bringing the Bible to groups of boys and girls in rural poverty, gave her a weighty influence with the senior clergy of the area, and this was clearly not welcomed by some. She was widely criticised for her interventions by landowners and farmers, complaining that the literacy of the poor would end in revolution, that they would all be reading Tom Paine. In one of More's letters, she notes, "It has been broadly intimated that I've laboured to spread French principles, and one of my schools is specifically charged with having prayed for the success of the French. I am accused of being the abettor, not only of fanaticism and sedition, but of thieving and prostitution." Some of this More sought to counter with her cheap repository tracts, which have been called wartime propaganda, written as an antidote to the radicalism of Paine. These stories, which are essentially 18th century morality tales, were written as much for the upper classes who bought and distributed them in fear of revolutionary change, to the middling sort and working people that they were written to persuade. Clearly, these have a political role, but the reason behind More's writing are absolutely connected to moral purpose. More's virulent opposition to the revolution in France was in good part because of their anti-clericalism. More may have written some of these stories to counter Paine, but much of this was because of his religious opinions. In her words, "I wrote purposely to counteract their pestilent pamphlets, to introduce into almost every one of them an exemplary parish minister. As works of imagination had been employed to induce contempt for the clerical character, I thought these the most popular vehicles in which to convey an antidote for the reigning disease." None of this, of course, removes the fact that it's incredibly interesting that a woman is actively propagandising at this time. So More's campaign to improve literacy and biblical study through schooling was not uncontroversial. The pushback at what was seen as her interference exploded in a nationally talked about drama, popularly known as the Blagden Controversy, where a curate, Thomas Beer, accused Hannah More of not controlling her teachers and letting them spread Methodism in the school and of opposing the clergy in the parish. In terms of an 18th century costume drama, this had everything. The rector who rarely visits the area, a curate who is wildly irritated at the woman organising schooling in the parish, the appointment of a magistrate who has no competence, an 80-year-old Bishop of Bath and Wells, sackings, public meetings in pubs, and More being accused of radicalism and Methodism in the anti-Jacobin newspaper, which was devoted to opposing the revolutionaries in France. It becomes a national controversy. In the face of this, Hannah More asked Abraham Elton of Cleveland Court to mediate the issue on her behalf. The debate plays out in newspapers and in published pamphlets. In the newspapers, More is depicted as one of Macbeth's witches and Pope Joan. There were published pamphlets against her, one by clergyman William Shaw, who lived not far from More in the small parish of Chelvey. It was offensive in the personal nature of the attacks and falls back rather than on the specifics of the case in point, but on personal attacks on Hannah More. In one section regarding Hannah More's annuity given by William Turner, he claims the marriage was avoided because of her violent temper, and love given at easy victory, and the money at a very easy rate. An accusation essentially that her money was gained from prostitution. The idea that the curate Thomas Beer had won the argument against More was rather nastily compared to a rape. The curate has laid Miss Hannah on her back, along the couch of reason and argument. In the anti-Jacobin paper, More is also criticised for asking someone to mediate for her, and says, in our opinion, it is a subject on which she ought not to have employed a champion, but to have manfully fought for her own battle. So she's criticised for being involved in matters for women not to be involved in, but also for not publicly defending herself, despite women not being seen as able to do that in the public sphere. In fact, Hannah More's letter to the Bishop of Bath and Wells made clear that she would not engage with the critics, although this meant that the criticism would then continue. She wrote, "My declared resolution to return no answers, I attribute in great part this long and unmitigated persecution." She had ill health her whole life, but a long period of illness was brought about from this whole incident, and she claimed, "My life has nearly been destroyed by these prolonged attacks." In More's justifications, she is careful to try and distance herself from the claims of radicalism by saying, "I will not allow of writing for the poor," although my research into the school at Nailsea suggests that Collier children indeed learnt to read and write. The accusations of Methodism in the schools, the enthusiasm, can be seen as evident too in the practice of her teacher Henry Young. So was she just hypocritically defending herself when in fact the schools were indeed doing these things? Her activism does show her facilitating social mobility, paying for extra education for minors, supporting teachers with help from Oxford University Dons, and so on. And this isn't evident in her writing, which seems very much to keep the classes in situ and not to advocate for any social mobility. I see this as exceptionalism. In More's strictures about education, she always notes that her views apply for most people, but those she saw as exceptional, she was prepared to actively help, whatever their class and rank, because of their attitudes in religious and moral matters. Perhaps a case of the ends justifying the means, as long as the ends were religious observance, morality, duty, and overall improvement. In later life, More does become more reactionary to activists such as William Cobbett. She was not immutable. She became even more entrenched in her conservatism in the face of political radicalism at the time of Peterloo. Against this, Henry the orator Hunt, well known in Bristol, criticised her as a fanatical female saint who was an imposter, and taking the misogynist line which the clergy in Somerset had led with before, he writes, "During her younger days she had been a very frolicsome lass. It has been whispered that some of these gentry were very frequent in their visits to the buxom dame, who now assumed the title of Mrs., contrived like the friars of old to indulge in the gratification of those passions to which it is said real saints are not prone. Some say that her conversion was not sincere, but it was a mere cloak to cover certain practices." So in conclusion, More's conservatism draws her into a confrontation with those wanting change. Where her career had brought her into claims of radicalism in the abolition movement, she was protected by the male cocoon of the Clapham sect. But when she acted alone, the opposition becomes incredibly personal against a woman who has strayed out of her lane. More's motivation in religious reform and her theology gave her no space from the disrespect of those countering all of her arguments based on her sex. Clearly, some of her activism was not as rigid as her writings, and this inflamed the criticism of those against her interference. Her role becomes too influential, critics turning to cry her with the most obvious epithets and abuse. And when she refused to engage, they appeal that she ought to have done so manfully. Hannah More's writing is deeply conservative and shaped by scripture, but implied criticism and need for reform. Her faith propelled her to stand up for what she thought needed to change and what should stay the same. But the opposition to her demonstrates that whilst women in the 18th century had been seen to be able to be the moral arbiters of society as part of their female sensibilities, in the early 19th century, the establishment and the political firmament were only ready to engage through easy channels of misogyny and personal abuse based on her sex, rather than in concrete political, social, or religious arguments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jo. That was fascinating to learn about such a remarkable woman who was being so active at a time that was very interesting in history as well, in the context in which she was living. And I just wanted to invite Jane first, just your initial thoughts on Hannah More's life, her stories, her activism, from what we've heard from Jo.
Wow, that was brilliant. Thank you, Jo. I learned so much. By the way, I bow to all of your knowledge. I'm slightly anxious about speaking about Hannah More, because you are clearly the expert in the room, if not the country, on Hannah More. I guess the thing about Hannah More, which is the thing that, and I'd be really interested to hear what you think about this, because when I do talks about the women who built Bristol, it kind of comes, people often say, why did I start doing this? And it comes from a place that there were, as I say, only 3 women that people in Bristol seem to know about, of which Hannah More was one, Hannah More, Mary Carpenter and Annie Kenny. But Hannah More obviously is relevant for this evening. And those 3 seem to be the ones that people, if they've heard of any women from Bristol, it's those 3. And I just, while you were talking, I started thinking, obviously, I was thinking, why Hannah More? But obviously all the things that you've just told us in the last 15 minutes have told us why Hannah More. But why Hannah More compared to some of her contemporaries or some of the other people? Because obviously that now sounds like I'm detracting from Hannah More, which is not what I mean to do. But she obviously had something really special about her and so many facets to her. And I'd be really interested to know why you think, or what it is about her that you think really stood her out from her contemporaries. So I bounced that question quite
Yeah,
nearly.
go ahead. I'm interested to hear the answer too.
I mean, I think there's a lot of different ways to answer it, but I think one of the things about Hannah More, which I find absolutely amazing, and one of the reasons I find her so fascinating, is that she has the most unbelievable social network. And one of my bits of research that I've been trying to do is actually to create a social network diagram of everybody that she corresponds, because she has a mass of correspondence. And in fact, a good opportunity to, a little plug here for some work at the Hannah More Trust. One of our main projects is actually creating a digital version of her correspondence. Because one thing that happened with More later, that, sorry, I'm now digressing, but it's a good point to get it in. When Hannah More dies, her letters and her correspondence are actually sort of edited by a man called William Roberts, and he edits them in a way which, to be honest, totally transformed the nature of the letters, to the point that her goddaughter actually said she wouldn't be able to recognise Hannah More from the letters. So it's really important that we actually get back to her voice and the original, transcripts of her actual work, rather than this interpretation of her work, which is created by this man. And I think that has really influenced a lot of how she's perceived after her death. But when she was alive, she had this amazing social network. She has these correspondence with the most amazing people all over the country. And she just knows everyone, and everybody knows her. And when she has her house built at Barley Wood, which is in Rington, which is an absolutely beautiful place, and I don't know if anybody, if you have the opportunity to go there for anything, please do, because it's lovely. But she has this amazing visitation of people there. So she's constantly got visitors that she finds it very exhausting at times, makes her ill, almost, the amount of people who come to visit her. She is criticised sometimes that she slights some people if somebody slightly more famous comes in when she's talking to people. And I think it's Coleridge who gets a bit snarky about that. When somebody with the title comes in and she goes off and talks to them, he doesn't like it. But yeah, she just knows everybody, she entertains them, she connects with everybody and keeps some correspondence going for decades. So I think some of this is why she's so well known, that she just has this huge impact in terms of networking with people and continuing the relationships. So I think lots of that is why she was remembered sort of in the immediate aftermath of her death, by all the kind of the different clergy that she knew and all the people obviously of in all of the villages that she connected with, but also all these famous people as well. So she works on all levels in terms of social networking, and I think that is one of her successes. And I often say to students, if she was on Twitter, she would have a blue tick. I think she would have had a lot of followers. She would also have followed lots of people, and she definitely would have had a blue tick.
I think that's definitely true. Sorry, I think that's definitely true what you say, because when I kind of cross-reference people within my books, Hannah more than anybody else, gets cross-referenced to so many other people. So she definitely was a social networker of her time, absolutely.
A question to Wendy, your initial thoughts and reactions to Hannah More as a woman of political activism and a social influencer.
I think it's really interesting to think that, you know, I Googled her because I knew nothing about her when you asked me to come on this panel. And I thought, right, I must find out about her. And of course, I read a few things she'd written. And I think I leapt to some of the conclusions that from what Jo said, I have to say, oh dear, I need to be fairer. Because I thought, oh my goodness me, this woman is responsible for repressing the French Revolution. And she's responsible for keeping little girls not being allowed to write. And also, so I kind of bought the, she wants some change, but not others, you know, kind of message. And I think it was so interesting that you contrasted, you know, what she wrote with what she did as well, and to say that you need a whole picture. And I certainly think about correspondence too, because I did my work on John Henry Newman. And if you want to know anything about him, you've got to read 32 volumes of letters and diaries before you can actually say, what did he think about how we come to faith? So I do think that, you know, the whole rounded thing is really interesting, and how easy it is to go down a rabbit hole and think you've understood someone, which I think happens now with social media, because you were talking about a blue tick, and I'm sorry, I'm an old fossil, I don't even know what a blue tick is, but I do think that we're really quick to judge people, and we're really quick to accept the kind of if you agree with someone and they're horrible about someone else, you become horrible about someone else. So I think it was really interesting what you said about the way that she was criticized and the way that people wanted to put her in a box. Because, you know I'm really guilty of that with my opinions about people. You know, I'm quick to put them in a box. And what you did to show me a much broader picture than I got by Googling Hannah More. So.
Yeah, and to sort of respond to Wendy's point there, I think that's absolutely true, because I think this interpretation of More, she becomes very unfashionable, obviously, at certain points. I mean, the fact that she refused to even read Wollstonecraft, she had her own opinions about Mary Wollstonecraft's life, and I think that influenced a bit, even though actually if you read them side by side, and there's some really interesting work that does that, they're not that far apart. But they look oppositional. So on first glance, you know, they're seen as, you know, people that absolutely are two sides of the debate. But actually, that's not the case when you really look into the detail of it. So yeah, she was I think there's an interpretation of More which became popular, that she was this rather cantankerous, old, you know, and there's always the old picture of her in the bonnet as well. Yes. And I mean, and I hate to divulge this on the internet, but she was my age when she started the schools in Somerset. She was 45, 46, and I don't think of myself as the old bonnet lady yet. Maybe at some point I'll go that route. But you know, she was actually quite a young, energetic person still when she was doing some of this activism, but in everybody's interpretations in their heads, she's this old harridan with these horribly entrenched conservative views, which actually isn't really the case. It's a lot more nuanced than that. And looking at her activism, I mean, you could say she's that she's a bit of a hypocrite with some of the things that she writes and what she does. But personally, I see it as protecting herself in a way from attack. And particularly, I think it really hurts her, this idea of sort of, being cast as a radical, because she wasn't. And I think she's therefore sort of fighting back against that criticism in her written work, very clearly saying, I don't allow of it.
Yeah.
But there are these exceptions.
And I was thinking about being unplatformed. That happens to people now, doesn't it? You get unplatformed because you express some tentative opinion that isn't expressed in the way that people are happy with you expressing it, and you can get unplatformed at the drop of a hat. And I wonder if sometimes you are people express themselves more conservatively than they really feel in order to stay in the discussion. I know that happens because although I work for the Methodist Church, I'm a Catholic. I'm about to get unplatformed by the diocese, but from what I'm about to say. But sometimes you using language that is more conservative and inside the dialogue space than you would be happy using if you were free in another dialogue space. Does that make any kind of sense?
Yeah, and I think it's even to the point where I was talking to somebody about this the other day, and on social media, and I know that Wendy, you described yourself as a dinosaur with it, but on Twitter, there is a thing about followers, and you can like things, and that people actually said to me, I'm a bit afraid to like that, because then people are quite judgmental about what you've been seen to like, and particularly on certain issues which are particularly fractious. That's something which almost people aren't prepared to do. So they're self-editing their sort of public persona very sort of definitively to make sure that they're not prejudged or put in a category because of that. So I think that's the kind of the rabbit hole that we've gone down now, that people are having to construct an identity online because it's actually too sensitive if you get these pylons of people.
And you can make a mistake, can't you? Yeah. A simple mistake, and that's or not say something as clearly as you want to, and
things taken out of context, and then someone who wants to believe that you've said the thing that they've interpreted you to have said then snowballs with it, and by the time you've gone off to make a cup of tea and come back, suddenly your whole world and your reputation collapsed with it.
Yeah, everything's aflame and it's all gone wrong.
Yeah, so I just found her a whole lot more interesting than I thought she was from what you said, so thank you. Yeah.
Thanks, Wendy. Yeah, it's so interesting to hear this from different perspectives and see how this is kind of affecting us today, and still talking about it on it being International Women's Month. It's a great time to be discussing these things. I'm sure people in our audience have got lots of questions that they're waiting to ask, so I'd like to just now invite you to pop those into the Q&A button at the bottom, and we will take a read of those in a few minutes. I've just got one more question I'd like to ask the panel, and that is related to things that are happening today. So we've seen in the news in recent weeks, it's been really relevant to explore the life of this woman who spoke out amidst widespread opposition. And I just wanted to ask, and I'll go to Jo first, how can we be inspired? How do you feel we can be inspired by Hannah More? And what can we learn from her? And what can we learn from those who opposed her public voice?
I sort of learn new stuff about her all the time, and she's one of these people where, as I said, she writes so much that you often come across things which can change your opinion of her or different things. So for me, though, the main thing that I learned from More is actually just staying on course, because what she does is, yes, she is horribly affected by things. She becomes horribly ill because of the attacks that's made on her. But actually, she doesn't really defer from what she's doing. She takes it on board. She's horribly ill. She finds she describes herself as too weak to continue, but she does. So her faith is strong enough that she is absolutely set on what she's doing. And I think that's a great lesson for everybody, that if you believe in it enough, just carry on going. And the enough, you will be criticised by lots of people, but if you really believe in it, just do it anyway. So I think feel the fear but do it anyway is a more thing to learn, really.
Yeah, and who you're listening to as well. She had a circle around her, didn't she, of good influences as well as bad opposition. And Jane, yeah.
I think Hannah More seems like she was very good at supporting other women, and I think that's a lesson we can all still take forward today. I think to help other women come forward, you have to champion them, you have to see what they do that is good, you have to encourage them, you have to promote what they're doing. You know, thinking of the milkmaid poet Anne Yearsley, who Hannah More worked with, and I think Hannah, I'm sure Joe can correct me if I'm wrong, I think Anne Yearsley was illiterate when Hannah More first came across her, but she helped Anne learn to read and to write, and then she helped her write poetry, and through these poems, Anne Yearsley then became quite a successful poet, and she earned quite good income, enough to fund a library down on the colonnade in Hotwells. And so I think that a lot of that was to do with Hannah More's support and Hannah More's patronage, and I think that's certainly something we can carry forward, in that we can see other women around us who are doing something that they're trying to progress, whether it's writing, whether it's music, you know, it could be anything, and to support and encourage them and give them a leg up so that they can keep doing that and move that forward. I think that's definitely something to do.
Thanks, Jane. Yeah, same question to you, Wendy.
I've forgotten what the question was because I've been too busy listening
question,
to the answers.
It's been some time. So it was about how do we feel we can be inspired by Hannah More today?
Okay, yeah,
what can we learn from her?
Yeah. It's really hard, isn't it? Because I'm absolutely in sympathy with what Joe said about, you know, feel the fear but do it anyway. And I think there's the discerning is a word I would want to use. I want to say, but do keep asking yourself whether you're right. Because however horrible criticism is, sometimes it might be right. But yeah, I do think I noticed what you said about her friends and how they helped her and supported her. And I think so that discernment isn't done in a vacuum, is it? The discernment is done in a kind of group of supportive friends. And I would certainly think that we're still in a place where you're right, that it's harder for in certain contexts, it's harder for women to speak than for men still. I think, you know, loads of progress has been made, but there is a kind of problem sometimes. And I was very, you know, some of that horrible language that was used about her is language you still hear, isn't it? That you still hear, you know, kind of some nasty stuff. So yeah, so yes, feel the fear and do it anyway. Pick your friends carefully, try to make sure that what you're doing is right, because, you know, you might get a lot of criticism because you're actually wrong. Yeah. Yeah.
Thanks, Wendy. Questions are coming in fast, so I'm going to go with the first one that we've been given. Was her concern solely focused on the rural poor? What about the urban poor in Bristol? Did she know of the work of the Strangers' Friends Society in Bristol, a focus for Methodist social activism from the 1790s? And Joe, you might like to jump in on this one.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that's a really good question, because actually her concern isn't just on the poor, it's actually for everyone. I mean, there is, again, this construction of More's sort of work that she was about sort of reforming the poor, but actually it was reforming the nation that she was interested in, and she was as interested at targeting the monarchy and, you know, the middling sort of person, sort of she was interested in, you know, the aristocracy and all these different sort of elements. So but in terms of her activism in Somerset, this was a lot of this was basically because she retires from Bristol and London, really, and Bath. They had a house in Bath as well on Great Pulteney Street, and part of the kind of, and some of it is to do with Anne Yarsley as well, and a bit of a scandal with that. But they actually sort of retreat to the country somewhat. So she isn't quite so active in Bristol. And she starts to really focus towards the Mendips and these small villages, because this is where she thinks she's best able to help. But obviously there are loads of situations with the urban poor in Bristol. And I think, you know, the Methodists headed, you know, were I think the Methodists and the Quakers together were probably the two groups who did most to alleviate issues for the poor in Bristol at that time. But More herself definitely, yes, was more orientated at that point towards rural reform, and particularly the small villages that she lived in, essentially, as her target for change.
Mm-hmm. And just a follow-up question on that, we've had about the Blagden controversy. Did she moderate her opinions after she had this opposition, after that controversy in particular?
That's also a really good question. That's one of the bits that I had to cut out because I felt I was going to be dominating too much of the talk. Because actually, some recent research that I've done shows that actually what she does, she has this period of illness and reflection, and you know, she's deeply sort of damaged by this whole controversy. But she decides to continue. So what she does, in the face of all these clergy who were so oppositional to her, she uses her social influence to change the clergy. So instead of changing her methods, she just changes the people. So she doesn't get, you know, so she actually removes the problem by removing the clergy. So she's actually, you know, quite manipulative with this. So she actually appoints or you know, asks senior clergy to appoint certain people to certain jobs. So for example, in Nailsea, and this is something that is research that I hope will come out, which will be published later this year, she seeks to appoint somebody who is part of the Clapham sect. So he's a guy who's lived next door to John Venn in Clapham, and his children have been baptized by Reverend John Newton, and he is surprisingly the person who's appointed to when the new church that is brought into Nailsea. So when there's this new position, this guy gets appointed to it as if by magic. So she insulates herself basically by removing the problem. You know, but to be able to do that, she had to be entirely influential, manipulative, and all the rest of it. But she obviously felt that the school was worth it, because the school in Nailsea was one of her most successful. I think she really would do anything to make sure that that continued, including just moving the people who were the problem. So that's what she does in the face of that controversy.
Thanks. Another question which takes more of a personal note, and I'd like to bring Jane in on this one as well. So anonymous attendee says she never married and was a woman of independent financial means. Was this more or less important than her ability to network? And I just wanted to ask that to Jo, but also to Jane in terms of the women you've researched in your books. Do you see a correlation between their ability to network and any other characters that stand out for you in that respect?
Well, that's interesting, isn't it? Because initially when you first read that question, I was thinking, because I was looking at it from a 21st century point of view rather than a Hannah More's point of view, I was thinking, well, no, of course not. If she's married, then why shouldn't she be able to network whoever she wants? But of course it would be different at that time. And at Hannah More's time, I guess if you were married, you were seen largely as a wife. You were seen as a representative of your husband. And in Hannah More's circle, if she had married, she would have married someone who was, you know, professional or who was distinguished. And so therefore she would be, you know, representing him as his wife. And therefore it would have been expected of her that she would perhaps curb some of her opinions and curb some of her behaviours. However, knowing what I know of Hannah More, which is of course very little compared to what Jo knows of Hannah More, I think this is a woman who would have struggled to contain her opinions and contain her behaviours, and perhaps that's a large part of why she never actually married. But there are a small number of examples of women who managed to both have a husband and to have an influential and successful life. There was a concert pianist around the similar kind of time, Jane Rockall, who lived in Clifton, who was a really successful concert pianist. Then she got married, and she, although she continued to compose music, she did compose it under her initials rather than as Jane Rockall. So she used initials, which is a shame. But she did continue to work, and she did continue to perform. And also, actually, just thinking while I'm speaking, she also did exactly what I was talking about a few minutes ago of supporting other women, in that she found this this violinist, this young girl, she was about 14, who was out on the streets. She was busking with a violin, and she just thought, wow, this girl's got something about her. And she took her in, and she paid for her to have proper violin tuition from a really respected violinist. And this girl went, I can't remember her name off the top of my hand, but I could look it up if anyone's interested. She went on to become a superstar, world-renowned concert violinist, thanks to this woman's intervention. And she was a woman who was married in a similar kind of era, and who was able to do this. But the instances of married women who went on to network and to have the kind of life that Hannah More enjoyed probably aren't that many, which is a great shame. Was that all of the question answered? Have I missed any?
That was all of the question. I wonder if I can take it to hone it in on Methodism, and I wanted to bring Wendy in on this next question. So someone has asked, do we see similarities between Hannah and John and Charles Wesley's mother, Susanna? I mean, she is known as the mother of Methodism, and I wonder if Wendy, you'd like to kind of look into that and see if you can see any similarity.
I think that Susanna's influence was local. Oh, hello, Tim. He knows more about this. I think Susanna's influence was kind of local and in her children, and she made a great deal of difference to them and their ability to influence other people. We read about her now, but I don't think she was well known when she was alive. I mean, but there were what Methodism. What she did do was to encourage John to let women preach, because he'd seen what she did round the kitchen table. So it was a kind of almost a one removed. I mean, I'm not a great historian of Methodism really, but certainly what I find interesting is the kind of assumption that I find in Methodism that women will be at the table now, which I think must go back somehow to those early roots. I think, I mean, when I was studying John Henry Newman, one of the things that we said about him was how interesting it was that he brought women, he would correspond with women, but he had real difficulties because a lot of these women had husbands and they used to mind that he was advising their wives, and he used to say, you better check it out with your husband. So I do kind of see that it was difficult, in those kind of times. So no, I'm sorry, I can't really answer from Methodism then. I can answer from Methodism now and say, I think now Methodism is really equal. Sorry, there'll be 100 Methodist women who will scream at me, but certainly compared with the context that I'm used to, having come into Methodism to, in the last couple of years, I would say gender is almost irrelevant, it seems to me. She says, as loads of people put terrible stories in the chat, and I think that goes back partly to Susanna. Sorry, whoever asked that question. I'm sorry, I'm a bit ignorant about that. But.
No, thanks, Wendy.
I mean, I would chip in there to say, I mean, I think one of the key things was the fact that, they were both happy to slightly annoy people, to get under people, and certainly in terms of
she was, yes. She used to withdraw sexual favours if Samuel annoyed her. If her husband annoyed her, she would say, right, that's it.
So, I mean, I don't think unless Henry Hunt's to be believed, that Hannah More ever really had experience of that, but she certainly got under people's skin, and wasn't afraid to challenge the clergy, and in quite established things. And I think many of them in Bristol, I mean, you've got this fantastic situation in Bristol in a way that it's absolutely pulsing with debate. You've got this early Methodism plus sort of reforming zeal in the evangelical movement, and you've got all these different ministers and clergy and lay preachers, and it's really quite dynamic. But the idea of a woman getting involved with all of that is still something which is problematic for many, because who is this woman to have these opinions and dispute us as as the clergy? So I think that is something that they did have in common, in terms of happy to irritate, to get their elbows sharp and get involved in that way. So yeah, I see some similarities there for sure.
Thanks, Jo. We've got
Can I ask a quick
sorry, Jane, go ahead.
Jo, have you ever come across Emma Martin, who was a free thinker in Bristol, but she was around kind of like the end of Hannah More's life, the last couple of decades. But she sounded, just from what you were saying, I was thinking, that rings a bell. And she was a Methodist, but she was a Lutheran. But she really believed in that men and women were absolutely equal. But then when she married, she not only did her husband take her name rather than she taking his name, which was extremely unusual, but she then got exiled and had to go to London, where she trained to become a midwife, and it was really extraordinary. But I was just thinking, from what you were saying, that that's the only instance I can think of a woman at that kind of era who was sort of equal. I've gone off on a tangent, haven't I? I'll shut up. I just kind of wondered,
there's all these amazing women, isn't there? I mean, there are all these amazing women in Bristol, as we know from your books.
I've gone off on a tangent, sorry.
That's right. I think we've got time for just one more question, and I really like the sound of this one, so I'm going to put forward it to the panel. Justin asks, do we need to take some of these stories, letters, writings of Hannah More with a slight pinch of salt? Presumably there was a degree of self-publicity involved. Are there examples of where she has clearly overstated her own achievements?
Oh, that's a brilliant question, I think. I think one thing to say about Hannah More is she is quite dramatic. I mean, one thing that I did a course with an adult education course, and one thing that we did, which was quite fun, was to read all of her letters in a certain sort of Hannah More style. And a lot of it always comes in with her saying, if we live, because she's always worried that she's going to die most years, she's often quite ill. And she often has these little turns of phrase that she's things like, oh, if we live, we'll do that, and here's courage for you that we're going to try this. She's quite dramatic, as in terms of what her intent is and what she's thinking, and that's just the nature of her letters, which are incredibly entertaining and witty, and you can totally see from her letters, rather than the sort of construction of her letters, which was published later, but reading her actual letters, you can see why she was so much fun to have around, because she is witty, she's charming, she's interesting, but she is dramatic. And I think, Justin, probably there may be an element of overstating herself in some of these letters, but some of the things are actually difficult for us to know, because she's the only voice that we have about some of these things that happen. And certainly in her sort of the Somerset sort of tales, there's no other sort of narratives that we can look to kind of check her narrative of events, because who's writing in rural Somerset in the 18th century? Nobody. Really, apart from a few scurrilous clergy writing nasty pamphlets, Hannah More. So that's what we have to compare it with. So I suspect a pinch of salt, I think, perhaps in some, and I think she does naturally have a certain sort of dramatic flourish, because she is a writer, and of course they're all a bit like that, aren't they? They all like a bit of drama and flourish to their letters, so perhaps.
Thank you so much, Jo. What a great way to finish. Sadly, we're out of time, so thank you so much if you did write a question. and sorry if we didn't manage to answer all of them. Just like to thank Jo, Jane and Wendy for participating in this discussion and sharing their thoughts and views. It's been really interesting to learn so much more about Hannah More and relate it to how we view things today. We will be sending out an email to all attendees with links to the bios and publications, so do look out for that. In particular, the New Room online shop is open if you'd like to learn more about women in early Methodism, and do check out the recent blog, which I believe has been posted in the chat, from International Women's Day, and you'll hear more about their stories there. I've just got a couple of notices to finish, and that is to talk about our next Wes Talk. The next Wes Talk will be on Monday the 19th of April, and that'll be at 7:30. And the question we're going to look at for that one is, how can we work for peace in an angry world? We live in a world which seems to be permanently angry, from full-on conflicts between countries to aggressive trolling on social media. Is it possible to live and work for peace? This talk will have John Cooper, who's Director of the Fellowship of Reconciliation, and Reverend Inderjit Bogle, who's a theologian and Methodist minister. Do book your tickets online via the events section of the New Room website, or sign up for our monthly newsletter. Finally, we're going to bring up a poll question on your screen regarding your thoughts for this evening. Please do answer the question before you leave. And thank you so much for coming, and we look forward to seeing you again next month.